Heat and drought are expensive and distressing, and wildfire is a dramatic effect of hot, dry weather. But there's an amazing variety of other types of impacts that happen as a result of a little too much energy being trapped in our atmosphere. That's why there are thousands of scientific papers published every year on parts of the picture. It's hard to wrap your head around. Because it's so important for policymakers to try to understand the ins and outs of the impacts of climate change, Congress passed legislation in 1990 requiring a detailed report to be provided to Congress and to the President, summarizing these effects and trends as they relate to the United States. This document is called the National Climate Assessment. The last fully released report came out in 2019 and was just over 2,000 pages long. The next report, expected to be released this year, is sure to be even longer. To give you an idea of the reach of climate impacts, I just wanted to show you the chapter list from the current National Climate Assessment, showing the general categories of impacts we are experiencing. As you can see, just about anything you might be interested in is affected by the climate. Naturally, each of these chapters has a lot to say. I put a link to the National Climate Assessment in the Connections page in case you'd like to check it out. I can't summarize all the ways that climate change affects all of the types of things discussed in each of these chapters, but since I'm an ecologist, I'll just give you a tiny sample of the kinds of impacts my profession brings into view. Even if you're not an ecologist or particularly ecology-minded, think about visiting New England in the fall and finding that the gorgeous fall foliage you were hoping to enjoy on your vacation had faded away because the forests are not healthy due to a combination of climate issues. Or you take your family on a once-in-a-lifetime vacation to snorkel on a coral reef and find that what should be vibrant, colorful, and full of life is more of a gray wasteland. I could go on with similar examples. The fact is that ecosystems throughout the world are under extreme climate stress. Every ecosystem exists in a complex and delicate balance with the environment and among the living members of the community. The amount and timing of rain and snow, combined with the regular ups and downs of temperature, govern what plant species grow in an area, and the plant community is a big part of what makes habitat suitable for various animals. The locations and quality of habitats are shifting, and these changes are threatening a lot of species with extinction. In fact, up to 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of disappearing forever. Just to focus in a little, I'll tell you a little climate story of my own. 2016 was a big year for me. I turned 50 and I got a PhD. At that point, I found myself free from having to spend every waking moment working on my dissertation, and with the attitude of entering what I optimistically called my third quarter, it was time to pick up a long-neglected hobby. So I grabbed my camera and started getting reacquainted with wildlife photography. Since pronghorn antelope are a handy wildlife species where I live, and since they're really beautiful, I figured I'd start with photographing them. The thing about photography is it's not about the camera, it's about looking at things. So through my lens, I started looking. As I watched, I started to see that life isn't always easy for wild critters. The next winter was a little unusual. We had some tough cold spells mixed with some warmer winter weather. As I watched my beloved pronghorn heading into the winter, I discovered that while these creatures of the northern plains are well adapted to cold and snow, there was a new wrinkle. The warm spells that made winter feel milder to me were not making life easier for animals that find food by digging in snow. When there's snow on the ground, antelope and other hoofed herbivores dig to find the grass underneath. When the weather warms up, the surface of the snowpack melts. When the cold comes back, that melted surface turns into a layer of ice that a hoof can't dig through, locking these animals away from their food source. This can also happen during winter warmth when what would normally have been a snowstorm comes as rain instead. When this happens over existing snow, the result is the same, a hard layer of ice. As I looked to see what I could learn about these effects, I learned that I wasn't the first to notice this going on. In fact, the impacts on animals from what are called rain on snow and snow crust events have become a serious concern in the Arctic as winter warmth becomes more common. For example, in 2013, 61,000 reindeer starved to death in the Russian Arctic due to this climate shift. Scientists across the northern parts of the world are finding that these shifts in the quantities, types, and timing of precipitation are changing snowpack characteristics, and problems from many species adapted to cold climates are arising. Another hoofed animal, the moose, is feeling the effects of climate in a more disgusting way. In 2022, scientists in Vermont tracked moose calves to see how they were doing and how they fared during the winter. These moose were having troubles too, but not due to being unable to find food. In fact, it was more related to being food. Almost 90% of the moose calves that were tracked died over the winter due to being parasitized by winter ticks. Ticks are among the many parasitic critters whose range is expanding fast because the winters don't get cold enough to reduce their survival. And moose aren't the only victim that ticks attack. Humans are also potential hosts for ticks, including those that carry Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, tularemia, and even some brand new diseases. While we're talking about climate change elevating human health risks by messing with ecosystems, I can't help mentioning another whole category of gross thing made grosser in a warm climate. Toxic algae. Here are a couple of snaps that I took of blue-green algae on livestock water ponds near where I live. This is just one of several kinds of harmful algae. This is a nice satellite image of a big algal bloom on Lake Erie a few years ago. People who live near the ocean are familiar with red tide, which is a bloom of a species of toxic algae that occurs most commonly off the Gulf Coast from Florida all the way to Texas, as well as in various places on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Red tide is not a new thing, and climate change is not the only cause, but conditions bringing about red tide blooms are made a lot more intense by direct and indirect effects of climate change. The organism that causes red tide produces a potent toxin, which can have quite a few nasty effects for people and other critters. In a severe red tide, water is toxic for swimmers, and the beach recreation is less fun because of all the dead sea life washing up on beaches, which can include thousands of fish, as well as dolphins, sea turtles, birds, and other things. That same toxin also goes airborne, and that's when it adds to the smell of dead animals and can cause severe respiratory and neurological health effects in humans. Needless to say, this can translate to economic impacts in places where beach tourism and fisheries are major industries.